My talk today is about a manuscript from Dunhuang in the codex form, and it contains a series of Buddhist texts, most importantly, the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra. This is a manuscript I have written about in my recent book, but because since then I found other pieces belonging to the same manuscript, I would like to continue the discussion and make a number of other observations which in turn will be related to our understanding of the nature of the library cave at Dunhuang. So here you can see manuscript S5531 from the British Library, and it is in the codex form, which means it is a volume that consists of several quires. So the quires are these separate gatherings, each of which is basically a notebook, and there are 4 of them here. And each of these consists of 8 sheets of paper folded in half, so 8 bifolia. And those sheets of paper are sewn together along the centerfold, and then at the same time they're also sewn to each other. So here you can see the centerfold of one of these quires, and the thread is partially torn, but partially still remains here. It's mostly of beige color or maybe colorless, and bits of it have green and red in them. At the end of this manuscript, on the inside cover, we see a date, which is the 20th day of the 2nd month of the Gongchen year. And this Gongchen year repeats every 60 years, but in this case, it probably represents the year 921. And this manuscript contains a series of 10 Buddhist texts. Most of them are short, and at least one of them is relatively long. And that is the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is at the very beginning. This is the last page with the text on the manuscript, the end of the Heart Sutra, which was one of the popular texts, and in this volume it represents the very last one. And in my book, initially when I analyzed this manuscript, I argued that based on the different handwritings, there are at least 4 or 5 different people involved with copying the text into this manuscript. And looking at it in connection with other similar booklets from Dunhuang, I argued that these booklets were likely produced by members of the same family in connection with the commemoration of the dead. So as part of the mourning ritual for somebody within that family. And different family members were involved in producing the same manuscript. Each person copied a text or portions of a text, and together they produced a single manuscript. The first text in this manuscript is the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra. On the first page, the text begins in mid-sentence, which means that part of the text is missing from the beginning. And if you calculate the amount of missing text, it becomes very clear that the amount of text missing from the beginning is just about 1 quire. That is 8 of these sheets of paper folded in half, altogether representing 32 pages. So it is very clear that one of these quires, the first quire, is missing from the manuscript, and what we have here is actually already page 33, so to speak. So if we look at the structure, this is what we can see. This is how I represent the 4 different quires, and there is one that is missing, and I marked that in red on the right hand side. And fortunately, after publishing my book, I was able to find one of the sheets from that missing quire, and that sheet is in the Russian collection in St. Petersburg. The press mark is DH962. And the reason why I recognize this sheet as being from that same manuscript is based on several factors. The first of these is that it was also in a codex form, so even though this is only 1 sheet of paper, it's obvious that it was part of a booklet, that is part of a codex. Then there is the shape of individual folia, because each of these has this very characteristic arch on the top and also at the bottom. And the third factor that made it immediately obvious that we might be dealing with the same manuscript was the handwriting. And so this is the same handwriting as the beginning of the British Library manuscript. As you may remember, there were at least 4 or 5 different hands in that, but at the beginning, the text of the Lotus Sutra was written in the same hand. And when I was flipping through the volumes of the Russian collection, basically it was this handwriting and also the shape of the pages that alerted me to the fact that this might be from the same manuscript. And once I compared them, it became very obvious that the sewing holes also in the right position, and just as importantly, the text continues seamlessly from one manuscript to the other. So this is the other side of this sheet of paper. This black part of it would be the cover of the original booklet. Not only is the handwriting the same, but actually the same text continues seamlessly. So that makes it quite obvious that the fragment on the right once belonged to the same booklet. And we can also see the other side and see that it's much, much darker. And so it's quite obvious that this part would have been the front cover of the entire booklet, and this one would have been the back cover. And these 3 lines of text, they were not part of the original booklet, but were added in the early 20th century by Stein's secretary. So this is something we can safely disregard when considering the original booklet. So if we go back to the original diagram of the quires, we can see that from this missing first quire, we have been able to locate the outer sheet of paper, one side of which was the front cover, and the other side was covered in text that continued seamlessly to the first quire of manuscript S5531. And after having been fortunate to accidentally recognize this fragment of the first quire, I again accidentally recognized another bit from the same quire. And this is manuscript Paleo-Tibetan 1262 from the Paleo collection in Paris. This is a fragmentary booklet which consists of 3 folded sheets of paper, that is 3 bifolia, without any threads, so the thread was lost. The front cover has the text of the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, but quite interestingly, it has Tibetan sound glosses next to the characters. The other pages contain no Tibetan, so it's only the first page that contains Tibetan. But because the Tibetan sound glosses are so important for linguistic purposes, this manuscript was reclassified as a Tibetan manuscript. So as you can see on the top, it was originally Paleo-Chinois 2935, but then at a later point in the Bibliothèque Nationale, it was recatalogued and became a Tibetan manuscript. In a way, that also meant that scholars working on Chinese manuscripts were probably no longer aware of it because this was part of the Tibetan collection. So altogether, this manuscript contains 12 pages, and all the other pages have only Chinese text. You can see here on the right. And again, what's characteristic is the shape of the pages, which have this arc that is otherwise not that common. And also, of course, the location of the sewing holes. Now, if we put it next to the Stein manuscript, the shape is quite similar, but the handwriting is different. And that's completely okay because we've seen already in this manuscript that the handwriting can change because it involves several different people. Now, if we go back to the structure of the quires, we can see that in addition to finding this outer sheet, we have been able to locate these 3 inside sheets. And so now we have basically 4 sheets of the original 8 sheets in this quire, but the other 4 are still missing. This way we're able to join together 3 different fragments that originally were the same manuscript. But we can also make a number of other observations that are quite interesting. One of them is that the Tibetan sound glosses on the first page of this manuscript are written on the right-hand side of Chinese characters. And interestingly, they are written in the same orientation as the Chinese. So the pronunciation of each Chinese character appears next to it. And so basically the text remains in Chinese, and what we get in Tibetan is only the pronunciation of individual characters. Because Tibetan normally is written horizontally, it's actually not that straightforward to read the text in Tibetan because you would be going in this 1 or 2 syllable chunks in order to read the text. And this is in contrast with another Chinese manuscript that has Tibetan sound glosses, and that is Paleo-Tibetan 1046A, which contains the Tianziwen, so the 1,000-character text in Chinese, and then the Tibetan sound glosses are added on the left-hand side, but turned counterclockwise at 90 degrees. So in order to read the Tibetan text, you have to turn the paper sideways, and then you can read the text continuously, as if it was written in Tibetan. So you can recite the text of the 1,000-character classic without having to stop and read it 1 or 2 syllables at a time. So it's quite different from what we see in this fragment, because in this case it becomes obvious that you cannot read the text of the sutra continuously in Tibetan. In a sense, you're learning how to pronounce the Chinese characters. So the focus here is on the characters, that is the language, rather than the sutra itself. And this realization is very important because it represents a different kind of engagement with the text. So this text was not necessarily read as a Buddhist text, or it was not read as part of a ritual. Rather, it was used to practice the pronunciation of Chinese characters, to practice reading Chinese. And that's a completely different mode of engagement with this manuscript than what it was initially produced for, which was in connection with the morning ritual. And so this little fragment allows us to consider the different stages in the life of this manuscript. Because after the manuscript was initially produced by members of the same family to commemorate a deceased person in the family, then the manuscript went on to be used in a different context. We can think about these different stages the following way. The first stage would have been that this booklet was created as part of a morning ritual, and the texts were copied by several people. So even this first stage had some sort of chronological dimension. It did not happen in a single day, but probably happened days, weeks, or even months apart. Based on the date at the end, we can say that it happened in 921. But then this booklet continued to be used beyond this original ritual. And the reason why we know this is that it eventually came apart. I don't think it came apart while being used as part of this morning ritual, because then it probably would have been fixed immediately. So one or more people continued to use this booklet, probably reading the text or reciting the text or maybe learning from it, but beyond this original context of commemorating a specific family member. And so it was probably used by other people, possibly even unrelated to this original family. And then at one point this booklet comes apart. And again, that would probably be already the third stage in the life of this manuscript. And then as the booklet came apart, different parts of it were displaced, and eventually somebody took these pages that belonged together and added Tibetan glosses to the first page. And it's very likely that this was a separate stage in the life of the manuscript because the sound glosses were added to the first page. So the previous pages were already lost. So the person who added the sound glosses only had these 3 pages in front of him and didn't know where the other pages were. Technically, it's possible that the previous pages also contain Tibetan sound glosses, but I think it's unlikely because of these 12 pages that are part of Paleo-Tibetan 1262, only the first page has Tibetan writing on it. If there were other pages before it, it is very unlikely that this would have been the last page with Tibetan on it. And then the next stage in the life of the manuscript is that the separate pieces were collected and deposited in the cave. And quite interestingly, these pieces were not put in the cave together. So when in the early 20th century, Abbot Wang was selling the manuscripts to foreign explorers, the different pieces were not together. It is not a probable scenario that the 3 different pieces were taken apart by anyone in the 20th century. Most likely they were in different parts of the cave. So they were all here together, but they were already disconnected. And so it was not obvious that they fit together. And finally, it's also instructive to consider why these different parts of this original booklet have not been put together earlier. The most obvious reason is, of course, that the 3 pieces we joined together here were in different collections in different countries. One in London, one in Paris, one in St. Petersburg. Then the Paris part was moved into the Tibetan collection. Thereby it was removed from the field of vision of people working on Chinese manuscripts. Effectively, it was hidden away. And then finally, that the manuscripts have not been digitized before, and for a long time were only available in microfilm form or printed editions, some of which were based on the microfilms. Here, for example, we can see manuscript S5531 as published in the Dunhuang Baozang. It is cropped, and so you cannot see the arched edges, which effectively means that you cannot see the most characteristic aspect of this booklet. You simply don't have that information. And so it's only with the digitization of these manuscripts that we start having access to many non-textual features of the manuscripts, such as the shape of individual pages, or red dots and punctuation, which are usually not visible on such black and white reproductions. So all in all, this manuscript was an example of how it's possible to piece together different bits of a manuscript, partly based on non-textual features, such as shape, size, the location of the sewing holes, and also what that entails. So going beyond just simply being able to piece together fragments from the same original manuscript, we can also think about the stages in the life of a manuscript. And it becomes very obvious that what we see today is not just the result of the production of manuscript at a specific point in time, but also of the subsequent decades or centuries of use, of how other people and other generations may have used the same manuscript for different purposes. So the same manuscript that was initially produced for one purpose would have been used subsequently by other people for different purposes. And this is something we're not always very aware of, but it's actually very important if we want to understand how manuscripts and texts were used by actual people, by communities. All right, thank you for watching, and see you next time.